In the summer of 1973, just weeks before his death, Bruce Lee was no longer the restless young fighter trying to prove himself to the world. He was 32 years old, internationally famous, physically sharp despite exhaustion, and mentally operating on a level very few people around him could fully follow. Enter the Dragon was completed, contracts were being discussed, interviews were piling up, and his name had finally become synonymous with martial arts itself. Yet behind the scenes, Bruce was quieter than usual. Friends noticed he spoke less about fighting and more about understanding, less about speed, more about clarity, less about winning, more about control. Those closest to him sensed that Bruce was organizing his thoughts, not for competition or fame, but for something deeper he felt compelled to leave behind. During training sessions in Hong Kong and Los Angeles, Bruce began repeating ideas that confused many of his students. He spoke about effort being wasted, about tension being the enemy of truth, about strength becoming useless once ego entered the room. Fighters who expected drills, sweat, and physical punishment instead found themselves listening to long explanations about fear, identity, and the danger of becoming attached to your own image. Bruce would pause mid-session, lean against a wall, and ask questions rather than give answers. Why do you need to prove this? Who are you fighting against, really? To some, it sounded philosophical. To others, frustrating. Very few understood that Bruce was no longer refining techniques, he was refining perspective. One evening, after a private training session, Bruce sat with a small group of students and collaborators. No cameras, no press, just conversation. He explained that mastery was not about adding more skills, but about removing unnecessary ones. He warned them that fame creates noise, and noise separates people from reality. Most people, he said calmly, confuse movement with progress. He explained that the closer someone gets to real understanding, the less dramatic it looks from the outside. Real growth, he insisted, is silent, invisible, often misunderstood. At the time, those words seemed abstract. Only later would they carry weight. Subscribe to the channel and leave a like. There are many more Bruce Lee stories and lessons still waiting to be discovered. As the days passed, Bruce's conversations became increasingly focused on restraint rather than expansion. Those who trained with him expected intensity, yet what they encountered instead was patience, long pauses between movements, deliberate breathing, and an insistence on slowing everything down. Bruce would stop a drill after only a few seconds and ask a student to repeat it again. Not faster, not harder, but calmer. He explained that speed without awareness was just chaos dressed as skill, and that most fighters were addicted to aggression because it masked insecurity. Many didn't like hearing this. A few even thought Bruce was becoming detached, perhaps softened by success. They didn't realize he was stripping everything down to what truly mattered. In private moments, Bruce spoke openly about pressure. He admitted that the constant demand to perform, to be the fastest, the strongest, the symbol, was heavier than any physical training he had endured. He explained that the world wanted a myth, not a human being, and that myths are prisons if you start believing in them yourself. He warned his students not to confuse external recognition with internal balance. If your worth depends on applause, he said quietly, you will never be free. These weren't motivational speeches. There was no performance in his tone, just a calm urgency, as if he knew time was limited and clarity mattered more than comfort. One afternoon, during a quiet session with only 2 students present, Bruce demonstrated a simple movement, a step, a turn, a relaxed extension of the arm, then stopped and asked them what they saw. They described technique, angles, efficiency. Bruce shook his head. That's what it looks like, he said, not what it is. He explained that the real lesson wasn't the motion, but the absence of resistance inside the body while performing it. No internal argument, no doubt, no excess intention, just alignment. He told them that most people fight life the same way they fight opponents, tense, reactive, desperate to control outcomes, and that this internal struggle creates far more damage than any external conflict. At the time, these lessons didn't feel urgent. Bruce was alive, present, still training, still teaching. There was no sense that these words would soon become echoes rather than conversations. But some students later recalled that his tone had changed. Not dramatic, not ominous, just precise. As if he were choosing each idea carefully, knowing it might be the last time he explained it. What sounded philosophical then would later feel like instructions left behind on purpose. In his final weeks, Bruce Lee became increasingly selective about who he trained with and what he chose to demonstrate. He no longer felt the need to impress anyone, and that absence of performance changed the atmosphere around him. Sessions were quieter, more deliberate, almost uncomfortable for those who expected intensity and spectacle. Bruce would often stand still for long moments before moving, letting silence stretch, forcing everyone in the room to confront their own impatience. When he finally acted, the movement was minimal, nearly unnoticeable, yet perfectly placed. He explained that when something is truly efficient, it looks unimpressive to the untrained eye. Power, he said, is rarely loud when it is real. During one conversation, Bruce spoke about fear in a way that surprised even his closest students. He didn't describe fear as weakness, but as attachment. Attachment to identity, reputation, outcome. He explained that fighters who panic are not afraid of being hurt. They are afraid of losing the image they've built of themselves. This, he warned, is why many skilled people collapse under pressure, while less gifted ones remain calm. Skill without detachment becomes fragile. Strength without humility becomes brittle. He emphasized that the highest level of control is not domination over others, but over one's own reactions. If someone can provoke you, he said, they already control you. Bruce also spoke openly about exhaustion, not physical, but mental. He admitted that constantly being watched had taught him how easily people mistake appearance for substance. He said the world had learned to copy his movements, but ignore his thinking, and that this misunderstanding frustrated him more than criticism ever had. He warned that techniques spread faster than understanding because they require less effort. Anyone can imitate motion. Very few are willing to dismantle their ego. He urged his students to train their minds with the same discipline they trained their bodies, because without that balance, mastery becomes performance rather than truth. Looking back, many would later realize that Bruce was no longer teaching how to fight. He was teaching how to exist without constant internal conflict. His lessons were no longer about defeating opponents, but about removing the need to prove oneself at all. At the time, some found this disappointing, even confusing. They wanted more techniques, more drills, more secrets. They didn't understand that what Bruce was offering was not something that could be demonstrated in a few seconds. It was a way of thinking that required years of reflection, patience, and the courage to let go of certainty. As the days moved closer to the end, Bruce Lee's teaching took on a tone that felt less like instruction and more like clarification. He no longer framed his ideas as discoveries, but as reminders, things people already knew but had buried under ambition, comparison, and noise. He spoke about how most suffering comes not from failure, but from resistance to reality. When life doesn't behave the way we expect, people tense up, emotionally and mentally, just as inexperienced fighters do when they feel threatened. That tension, Bruce explained, is what drains energy, clouds judgment, and turns simple situations into unnecessary battles. The fight, he insisted, is almost always internal. In one of his final conversations with a close collaborator, Bruce reflected on how misunderstood his philosophy had become. He said people loved the phrase, "be water," because it sounded poetic, but very few actually practiced it. To be water, he explained, is not to be passive or weak, but to stop insisting that the world conform to your expectations. Water doesn't argue with obstacles. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't prove anything. It simply adapts, flows, and continues. Bruce believed that this principle applied far beyond combat to relationships, to career, to identity itself. The moment someone becomes rigid in who they think they are, growth stops. He also warned that intensity without awareness eventually turns against you. He had seen fighters burn out, artists collapse under pressure, and talented people sabotage themselves because they could not slow down internally. He admitted that earlier in his life, he had chased extremes, more speed, more power, more recognition, believing that intensity alone led to mastery. Only later did he realize that balance was the missing component. Without balance, effort multiplies stress instead of results. This realization, he said, came not from victory, but from exhaustion, from reaching the edge of what force could achieve and understanding its limits. For those listening, these words didn't feel dramatic. There was no sense of finality, no grand farewell. Bruce spoke the way someone speaks when they believe there will always be more time. Yet his calm carried a weight that lingered long after the conversations ended. Only in retrospect would people recognize that Bruce wasn't closing a chapter. He was distilling everything he had learned into principles simple enough to survive without him. After Bruce Lee's death in July of 1973, many of the people who had trained with him replayed those final conversations in their minds, trying to understand what they had missed in the moment. At the time, his words had seemed thoughtful, even wise, but not urgent. Only later did the pattern emerge. Bruce had not been preparing them to fight better opponents. He had been preparing them to face confusion, pressure, success, and loss without losing themselves. What he left behind was not a system of techniques, but a framework for navigating life without constant internal resistance. Years later, students would realize that Bruce's final lesson was not about martial arts at all. It was about simplicity, about removing excess ego, excess force, excess fear. He had spent his life mastering speed, power, and precision, only to arrive at the understanding that true mastery is quiet. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It simply functions. Those who chased his movements without absorbing his thinking missed the point entirely. Those who listened carefully understood that Bruce had already moved beyond the need to prove anything. In interviews after his death, people often asked what made Bruce Lee different. Was it his speed, his strength, his discipline? Those closest to him eventually gave the same answer. It was his clarity. Bruce understood earlier than most that fighting the world, fighting others, and fighting circumstances is endless. The only fight worth resolving is the one inside, the need to dominate, to be right, to be seen. When that fades, action becomes natural, efficient, and calm. That was the lesson few people truly understood at the time because it didn't look impressive. It looked simple. Bruce Lee did not leave behind a final speech or a definitive explanation of his philosophy. He left fragments, conversations, notes, moments of insight shared quietly with those willing to listen. Over time, those fragments formed a complete picture, a reminder that growth is subtraction, not accumulation, that freedom comes from adaptability, not control, and that the highest form of strength is the ability to move through the world without unnecessary struggle.